Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to our 2018 first quarter ASLA CLARB Joint Licensure Web Summit. As you are aware, CLARB and ASLA are committed to working together to support our members in the defense of licensure to protect the public. This is our second formal joint event, and you'll be hearing more about future events towards the end of this presentation. But we really want to thank you again for being part of this valuable collaboration. And before we get started, Andrea has some housekeeping items.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, just a reminder to everyone that we will be recording this event. That way, if you want to come back and be part of it, come back and view it or share it with any of your colleagues. We'll have a recording available shortly after this webcast. Also, we are recording it, and just so that to kind of help with background noise, we recommend that if you're just listening kind of most of the presentation, to mute your lines, to mute your phone or your computer. There should be a button kind of at the bottom of your Zoom. It's fairly easy, a little mic button to mute or unmute yourselves. And we'll have times throughout the presentation that we'll ask you can unmute and ask questions. But throughout the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to send me a chat message. You can either send it to everyone in the group, or you can specifically send a private message just to me, Andrea Elkin, and we'll address those questions as we have time throughout the presentation. Points that we'll stop for questions. Should you have any difficulties throughout the meeting, if you have a moment, I'll give a moment here. You can jot down Zoom's contact information and our web ID, which is 850-505-462. Otherwise, we can go ahead and jump into the presentation. Today, we will have Joel Albizo from CLARB. He is our Chief Executive Officer. We also have, as you heard earlier, Elizabeth Hebron from ASLA. She is their State Government Affairs Director. And last but not least, we have David Sprunt, who is working with CLARB as our Senior Licensure Defense Consultant, but he's also done a lot of work with ASLA as well. And with that, I will turn things over to Elizabeth. And just a reminder, if you could mute your line throughout the presentation, it helps a lot with the background noise.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So I just wanted to quickly run through today's agenda. And to let you know, as Andrea stated earlier, after each of these sections, we will take a time of Q&A. So don't worry, you don't have to hold your questions all the way to the end, because we have a lot to go through. So the first topic that we'll just be discussing are legislative trends and how we, ASLA and CLARB, are responding, understanding the legislation and the potential impacts of that legislation. The third subject are best practices in building strong relationships. And then we'll also just quickly review for you the resources that we have available to both ASLA and CLARB members. And last but not least, we'll talk about some next steps and next activities in defending licensure and our ASLA CLARB joint initiative. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Joel Albizo to talk about the legislative trends and responses.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to everybody for taking some time out of your busy day to be part of this, this webcast. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay. So what we have here is going on is kind of a perfect mix here of what I've called disruptive forces. You know, when we look at to read the paper, we listen to the news, we see what's happening in our legislatures. A big question is why are they picking on us? And the way we would describe it is you sort of have three forces coming together. You have political agendas and an alignment at the state and federal level among an ideology that views regulation as a burden. You also have interest groups and advocacy groups who have become very mature, very sophisticated, well-funded, and frankly, now they have the winds at their back. You know, they have a big cheering squad in legislatures and a ready hole to fill out there in the media environment. And then I think the third is kind of looking within. When we look at ourselves as regulators and those who support regulators like CLARB, we're a community that is focused on doing regulation well. We're not a community that is focused on talking about regulation and defending regulation. So in a lot of ways, we are as community unequipped. So you have an alignment of these forces, which I think is creating disruption. And then on the next slide, you will see, yeah. So this kind of reminds us of back in 1991, there was this incredible alignment of powerful weather forces off the New England coast, and a movie was made about it. It's called The Perfect Storm, and here you had the remnants of a hurricane and another storm system, 100-foot waves, 70-mile-an-hour winds, just devastation. So again, I think what you're seeing here is kind of an alignment of those political forces, as well as the interest group maturity, as well as the media, insatiable media. So if we go to the next slide, here's what we mean by alignment. And this is going to focus more on what's going on around the federal level and other aspects, because I know Elizabeth and David are going to get really into the state situation in a minute. One of the things that's unique about this particular storm that we're in is we see a lot of intervention happening at the federal level. Here are 4 things that I wanted to call out. The first is what's called the National Occupational Licensing Learning Consortium. Boy, that doesn't really roll off the tongue, but what it is a collection of about 11 to 12 states that want to get together to try to do something about reducing burdens for lower wage or occupations that don't require a lot of credentials. And it doesn't sound like a bad idea, except what looks like is happening is it's kind of being hijacked by the deregulation, anti-regulation movement led by the Institute for Justice. So, and a lot of support from the federal government for this. We also have noted that the Federal Trade Commission has been very, very active since the North Carolina Board of Dental Examiners case, the Supreme Court case. And since then, they have been very active giving guidance, publishing guidance, getting involved in at least 2 or 3 states and submitting testimony for licensure issues. And they've even had 2 federal roundtables here in Washington about mobility and data that supports or defends licensure. We're also seeing some congressional legislation at the federal level to try to create models. Some of them are using the District of Columbia as a model to try to essentially implement the Institute for Justice framework of licensure. Fortunately, these really haven't gone anywhere because they're just so extreme that it's really been hard to get consensus within their own conference on that one. And then finally, and this is relatively new, the White House about a month ago issued an outline, kind of a white paper for its priorities, describing its priorities for infrastructure legislation. And it was fairly, I think, predictable, except for the last paragraph. And I'll let you read what is written here in red. And I think the highlighted area, the underlined area, is one that we really need to pay attention to, because what we're talking about here is essentially saying that if you're licensed in one state, you're licensed everywhere for the purposes of working on these federal programs. So this is one that, nothing is going to happen on this very quickly, but this is one we really have to pay attention to. So if we go to the next slide, You know, we talked about the other forces. We're talking about the perfect storm. So you have the alignment between state and federal politics. But you also have this energized, mature interest group coalition. And some of these organizations, you see ALEC in the middle. This is an organization that really brings together state legislators and essentially distributes ideas. It's sort of an idea generation forum. You know, and you can see by the tagline there why it would be interested in deregulation. Obviously, everybody has heard of the Institute for Justice, and I think this is a primary think tank or interest group promoting a particular view of deregulation and of licensure. And the Mercatus Center up in the upper left-hand corner, we'll kind of come back to them in a little bit. This is a really well-funded academic research center here in Northern Virginia. And so if we go to the next slide, here is another aspect to, you know, this kind of the storm. I think I count about 8 here. This is sort of representing the narrative, the anti-regulation narrative. And what we find is that there are about 8 points that are made over and over and over again. And you can almost take any article, any speech, any presentation, and you can count the number of references to these. Some are, you know, more focused on one. Some are focused on a couple. But this is essentially the narrative. And essentially, it's very, very sophisticated now in how it's delivered and very well established. On the next slide, you are now seeing the result of all of this coming together and the kinds of, you're seeing the kinds of headlines that that all this creates. Now, these are, you know, these are pretty dramatic headlines, as you can see. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you how this seems to be working. So this is a recent clip from a Chicago paper, and you know, the idea is this is a very attention-getting headline, right? Dog walking. You have a picture of a cute dog, and you know, a very fashionable person there walking the dog. But you know, of course, everybody's going to look at this and read through this article. But buried in this article was the most amazing quote or idea that I've seen to date. And if we go to the next slide, we can read the idea. Now I'll let you read that for a minute. So I just draw your attention to 2 things. One is we're talking about a proposal to take away licensure functions from state and local governments. Well, that's pretty radical. I would agree with that. It's pretty radical. But I'd also call your attention to who this is from. This is from the general director of the Mercatus Center. So, you know, all I can say, if you click on the next slide here, all I can say is hopefully this is going to be like Fonzie jumping over sharks, and will, you know, is the beginning of the end of this kind of hyperbolic atmosphere. So if we go to the next slide, you know, this is really what all of us are dealing with. All of us, CLARB, ASLA, the boards, the chapters, we are stretched thin here. You know, we're doing what we do to regulate or to promote the profession or to do landscape architecture and work. We're not used to this level of conflict. We have some limitations. You know, we haven't been working at this for a decade. And frankly, you know, I think none of us is particularly anxious to take on some of these very well-funded groups. So on the next slide, this is another kind of a trend that we've been seeing. And again, this sort of looks at the state level, but is also a national trend. And that is that we have 24 states and counting who have taken it upon themselves to do a comprehensive review of licensure, of licensed occupations. And, you know, you see 24 there. Some of these reviews come right out of legislation. Some of these come from governors who have enabling legislation. I think what we show on the left is one of the first was a review in Oklahoma, which has been published. And I think they spent several years reviewing it and ended up proposing that a database created. So, you know, it's just something to be aware of. And, you know, some of these reviews look like they're right out of the Institute for Justice playbook. Others are a little bit more freeform. So if we go on to the next slide, this is another trend that we're sort of picking up on the national, perspective. And that is there is more focus on mobility. And without going through all of these, I think what is happening here is that, you know, the anti-regulation movement sort of first tried to deregulate specific professions. That wasn't so successful. So then they tried to introduce other legislation. You know, that wasn't as successful. Now, you know, it's something else, and now they're on to mobility. So if you look over the next couple of slides, you will see, for example, here, not too long ago here in Congress, there was a House hearing, and with this very explosive title, and I'll let you read the narrative over on the right. You know, what they're doing here is they're calling out what seems like a silly inconsistency and a problem that exists for a particular occupation as it relates to mobility. The problem that we're all having, whether it be landscape architects or physicians or accountants, is that we're all getting lumped into the same bucket. Now, if you go to the next slide, you will see that landscape architecture, when we talk about mobility being a problem, I think it's important to focus on how mobile landscape architecture is. And here is a graphic that we have that kind of shows you how it's not a problem. Number one is that we know that over half of landscape architects licensees in the U.S. practice in more than one jurisdiction. We know that landscape architects can work pretty easily in multiple jurisdictions because our requirements from jurisdiction to jurisdiction are very similar. We also know that all 50 states, D.C., readily accept an accredited degree from one of the 90-plus LAAB accredited schools, or LAAC, 4 years or less of experience, and the LARE as qualification for licensure. In fact, there's at least one state out there, possibly on the call, that if you have these qualifications, you'll get a license in 24 hours. And then finally, it's interesting that 92% of the licensees meet these standards that are shown in number 3. And of course, that means they can be very mobile very easily. And the 8% that are not included here usually have other types of degrees, architecture, sometimes engineering, and what is required there is a little bit more experience. So they have a pathway as well. So again, landscape architecture is a mobile profession, and efficiency is a hallmark of it, but we're getting lumped with the broad brush. So if we go to the next slide, you know, this is some good news. This is some positive news here, and that is that this has got the attention of the licensure community. All of us are engaged. We're talking to each other. We're working with each other. And starting with the next slide, we'll look at the national level. FARB is the Federation of Association of Regulatory Boards, and I'm president of FARB for the next 18 months, made up of 21 member associations from all the medical professions, architecture, LA, social work, et cetera, accounting. 500 boards are represented among these members and about 5 million licensees. I have just talked to, I think, my 18th colleague in FARB, CEO colleague, and the disruption that we're talking about right now is their number one concern, and I'm going to highlight that in a second. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We can go to that next one. So to highlight it, I'll let you just read this. And you know what I should have done is I should have asked everybody to guess what type of occupation would make this quote. You probably would have not guessed first it would be medicine. But this is the nature of the environment, and the volatility in the environment is none of us know what to expect. I just got off the phone with my colleague at the accounting boards group, and it's the same thing. We're all getting lumped in with the dog walkers. So if we go to the next slide, please. A little closer to home is some more good news to report, and that is the design profession associations, that's CLARB, NCWS, engineering, NCARB, and the interior designers now are all working closely together. We're having conversation on how we might engage in collective action. We all kind of agree that we want to do it. It's just a question of how. In a perfect world, this would have happened years ago, but that's not the way change happens. The constructive thing is that we're making progress now. Next slide, please. So I guess that sort of wraps up the initial section, and what I've tried to do again is give some insight into what is going on in terms of national trends and what might be some of the reasons behind it, but also sort of how the regulatory community is responding. And before we go into the next portion, I would just welcome any questions that you might have. I see there are a few that have arrived via chat, but Andrea, I don't know if we want to open up the phones at this point.
People should be able to, if they have a question, I would, so they can ask their question. If they unmute themselves, they're welcome to ask their question, or they can type it in the chat and I can read it out and see if you or Elizabeth or David answer, whoever's best. I think in the chat we've had some comments about how the green one-page little graphic might be good to share, so I think we could probably make that happen.
You bet. We're on it.
This is a good suggestion. But otherwise, yeah, send your questions in if you have any.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Joel?
Yes.
This is Debbie Peters. I have a question about licensure, and they're talking about the different states having different requirements. Like
Yes.
One state charges $50, one state charges $640. I'm sure that is all based upon how the state legislates the way that its boards operate and are funded. Some get funded out of the general fund, and some of them are self-funded. Just like in our state, we pay more for our licenses because we're self-funded. So is there any discussion at all on the national level about those differences and kind of refuting that as an argument against licensure?
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, I'm obviously aware that there are different fee structures around the country, but to be really honest with you, I haven't really heard that come up as an impediment to licensure so much, the fee structure. What we typically hear, if you go back to that, if you go back to that page of where there were all the 8 arguments, these are the things that we're hearing. And so where we would hear that is in the context of a hair braider or of well, I don't want to pick on dog walkers. I don't even know what that is. Or another kind of low-wage, kind of entry-level occupation. And I think when you're taking a lower-wage occupation and laying on sort of what are perceived as high or egregious fees, that is really where we're seeing the problem. We're not seeing so much complaining among people, to architect groups or medical groups or things like that. It's mostly the disadvantages, those of lesser means in education. So it's interesting that is coming up. We may want to talk offline about how to address that, but I would have to say it's not one that we're that's not one that is really generating a lot of traction nationally. That's probably a good thing.
Joel, this is Elizabeth. I would add to that, though, in some of the sunset reviews that we're seeing in some of these proposals for sunset type reviews, they are asking the questions, how do the licensing fees compared generally to the surrounding states?
That's a good point.
So they want to know.
Very good point.
Yep. So I know
that's an excellent point.
So it is good to be aware what's happening in your surrounding states. It's okay, from what I've seen with the from the legislators' responses so far, is that they do understand differences, but you need to explain those differences to them.
Especially, obviously, if you're much higher. But this
Right.
is also true of any other requirement. So if you're, requiring more experience than, a state, nearby state, or the, if your requirements are higher, absolutely, as Elizabeth said, you sort of want to be prepared to explain why that is.
So we had one question come in, and I don't know who's best to answer this, but says, I wonder if there's a thought to use examples of issues on behalf of the landscape architecture licensure similar to how others use it against licensure. And the example being the recent bridge collapse in Florida. Let's see. And any issues with non-licensed workers or companies completing the work that is kind of obviously hurting and might kill people. Did I say that?
Yeah, that's a one that is on everybody's mind right now. We have been, on a previous slide, we talked about our close relationship with our engineering group, NCWS, and we've had a lot of contact with the engineering group. And I think that the first instinct when we see something like that is we wonder if there was something that points back to licensure there. And what we're seeing right now is we're not seeing it point back to licensure per se. It's pretty delicate too, how you sort of use that kind of stuff. But we are keeping an eye on all of these things because unfortunately we all know the way legislation works sometimes in public policy is that there has to be a disaster to see any change. But it's a very good point. I noticed also, Andrea, there was a quote or note from Arkansas that is undergoing a legislative review, and actually we've talked to Kingsley about that, and it looks like a very substantial initiative, and I think we're going to be working as closely as we can with you and along with ASLA and others to try to survive that one.
Okay, well that's the only message or question that I've had come in as an actual question. Are there any other questions that we can answer at this time? Okay, well with that, I guess we can move on to the next section. If you have questions along the way, feel free to send them in the chat, and we'll get to them at our next question break. Now I'll turn things over to, is this Elizabeth now?
Yes. Sure. Okay. So as we had discussed at the previous Joint Web Summit, and I know at several ASLA events, and I'm sure Joel and Veronica and Misty have at some CLARB events, we really wanted to strengthen both our relationships between chapters and the boards at the national level and at the state level. And we brainstormed last year and decided to do that. We needed to develop additional joint resources. We needed to help facilitate and promote better communications and coordination between the chapters and the boards, and to make sure that we're collaborating in response to all of the threats that we're seeing. And that there was a great opportunity. And our 2018 focus is to strengthen the board chapter relationships, as we just discussed, and to increase participation in appropriate ways to defend licensure. Okay, next slide. So in this next section, David Sprett and I will go through the 4 different categories of licensure bills that we've been seeing pop up around the country. We're going to tag team on this. David is going to take the first two issues, and those will be bills directly targeting landscape architecture for deregulation. And the second is bills that create reviews or committees to oversee occupational regulations. And then I will take over and talk to you all about the Right to Earn a Living Acts as well as interstate compacts. We feel that it's really important for you all to understand these different types of legislation and the potential impacts that it can have on the profession. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone. So we've seen that there are bills being opened up around the country. This is the big picture. We're tracking active deregulatory legislative activity in 28 states and other issues in Nevada, Wisconsin, Montana, and some other states where there may be some reviews underway. Next slide. We'll go into detail on the different types here. So several bills around the country take direct aim at landscape architect licensing. Some of the bills shown in the states marked in red focus on deregulating the profession. The Virginia bill originally was for deregulating landscape architecture and hair braiding until the LA provisions were removed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that story in a few minutes, hopefully. Some of the bills, like the ones in Nebraska and Illinois, which is the Title II Practice Act, focus on reforming existing landscape architect regulations. Deregulation bills are generally focused on the belief that the government regulates too much and that regulation of occupations does not serve the public because it limits competition by preventing people from entering a profession. One of the core beliefs of their proponents is that the market will determine winners and losers, a kind of market Darwinism, if you will. But of course, that creates significant risk to the public and to practitioners. Next slide. So some of these landscape architect deregulation bills aim to remove oversight and replace it with a certification or a registration system and incorporate user reviews like those on Angie's List or Yelp. And what could possibly go wrong with that? Deregulation of highly skilled professions like landscape architecture, engineering, and others can result in more risk to public health, safety, and welfare from improper and incompetent practice. Without a system to ensure that practitioners have the education, experience, and testing by examination, the 3 E's of licensure, how can a client or a government agency who's hiring a landscape architect know that that person is competent to practice? Also, how can someone compete for projects in other jurisdictions that may require licensure? Next slide. So another trend that we're seeing around the country are bills or executive orders that create provisions or entities to oversee and study occupational regulations in the state and make recommendations for changes. These laws don't specifically target landscape architects, but are focused more broadly on occupational regulation. On this map, the 15 states shown in orange are the ones where this kind of legislation has been introduced just this year in 2018. The 5 in yellow are where the governor has issued an executive order to conduct such a study. And in Idaho, there's both an executive order and legislation regarding occupational regulation oversight. The oversight committees, commissions, or boards created by these bills or executive orders are an additional layer of oversight, and they're tasked with reviewing, approving, modifying, or disapproving state agency or board actions and conducting reviews of policies. Proponents say it's a way to ensure that the work of the board is based on a clearly articulated state policy. Next slide. So here are some of the key elements of these types of laws. They create the or enable reviews of occupational regulation by creating an oversight committee or commissioner board to do the work. Sometimes they enact sunrise or sunset provisions, and at least one instance they're proposing a sunset review every 3 years. And they also incorporate reviews of board regulations, sometimes as frequently as every year. And the result is increased oversight by the governor's office or the legislature. And some of the impacts of this could be a greater administrative burden on regulatory agencies and potentially unnecessary time-consuming reviews, potential for deregulation or dilution of professional standards if the oversight body comes up with decisions that are counter to the board, and that could result in the potential loss of protection for public health, safety, and welfare. Next, we'll take a look at the right to earn a living bills. Elizabeth, what's next? Next slide.
Thanks, David. So our Right to Earn a Living Act, it's essentially a model law that has been drafted by the Goldwater Institute, and it's been endorsed by numerous anti-licensure organizations such as the Institute for Justice, as well as other groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, whose membership includes thousands of state legislators from around the country. And Joel's slide earlier that had all of the different groups interested in occupational licensing reform, they've pretty much all put their stamp of approval on this Right to Earn a Living Act model law. As you can see, several bills have been introduced around the country in 2018, and there was also a bill introduced and passed last year in Arizona that was a right to earn. It was really a watered down version of a Right to Earn a Living Act. Next slide. There are really several pretty important key elements to the Right to Earn a Living Act. First of all, when you read through the bill, it starts out by emphasizing that in the United States, every individual has the right to pursue any trade, occupation, or profession that they choose, and basically the government should stay out of the way of the individual's rights. It's essentially, they're really essentially restating all of the groups that we discussed before, the Institute for Justice, ALEC, Goldwater, etc. It's really the philosophy that they're basing their reform proposals on. And then the second key element of the Right to Earn a Living Act is that the bill will require a review of all the occupational licensing laws in the state. And while conducting the evaluation, the reviewers assigned in the bill have to evaluate the need for licensing against a higher legal bar. So this means not just showing that the occupation has the potential to cause harm, as most laws are written, but the model law states that they must prove that there is present significant or present and substantial harms to consumers, which raises the legal bar from just showing harm to showing present and significant or present and substantial harms. And then the third component is a provision that allows challenges to the regulatory system through the judicial system. So in other words, if you're not happy with the law or a board's regulations, you can take your case to court. For example, if a person thought that taking an exam was unnecessary, or they were questioning the board's regulations regarding the number of years of required experience, they could now take their fight through the judicial system, and ultimately a judge would decide what rules and regulations were in the best interest of protecting public health, safety, and welfare. And the fourth component to this is that the legislation shifts the burden of proof to the agency or the board to justify licensing and the associated rules and regulations. So as you can imagine, there are several impacts to this legislation. Again, it would establish continual legislative reviews of occupational licensing, and as we discussed, it includes meeting a higher legal bar to justify the necessity of licensing. And there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to taking cases through the judicial system and leaving the rulings in the hands of the judges. There's very little precedence at this point when it comes to these type of cases. We have heard that the first case under the auspices of the Right to Earn a Living Act was filed in Arizona several months ago. And as you can imagine, it has the case has the support and the financial backing of the Institute for Justice. And it did involve a behavioral health therapist that was licensed in one state, but having difficulty obtaining licensure in Arizona. Additional impacts include the potential for less protection of health, safety, and welfare by lowering standards for professional competence, and of course increasing the administrative burden for defending against lawsuits and going through regular reviews. And finally, the fourth category we have for you today is interstate compacts. And this is a new area for us, so I thought it would be good to start with a short primer on compacts and discuss what they are. In their basic form, interstate compacts are contracts between two or more states that create an agreement on a variety of issues. And those issues could include establishing a legal relationship to resolve a specific dispute. When compacts were first created, a lot of them had to do with boundary issues. They also can create independent multi-state agencies to address specific policy problems, such as the Port Authority of New York and the New Jersey Compact. And also, they can establish uniform guidelines and standards for member states to follow. And examples of this would be the Interstate Compact for Nurses and Physicians Licensing, two separate compacts there. The concept of using compacts to enhance mobility is being supported and touted extensively by the U.S. Secretary of Labor, Secretary Costa, and the Federal Trade Commission, as Joel had alluded to earlier. And multiple governors, as we've seen, have been hearing what the federal folks have been saying and taking notice, and supports the development of compacts to enhance mobility. So we've seen these appear 3 times this year in South Dakota, Missouri, and Arizona. Okay. And the 3 bills that were introduced this year, they were virtually identical, which has to be for the compact to work. And all of 3 bills, the focus was on licensure mobility. If enacted, the bills would allow licensed professionals from one state to temporarily practice in another state. The temporary license would be 18 months for really most people, but if you were a military spouse, you could enjoy a 24-month temporary license. And the impacts of this, there are several. We have the potential dilution of professional standards to the least common state-to-state denominator. Again, an additional administrative burden on the boards. In some cases, as we've seen, like that of landscape architecture, most states already have an efficient and an effective method for granting reciprocity, really making this idea of a temporary license unnecessary. When it comes to the military, I have multiple friends in the military, and they're all given a lot of warning of when they have to move or will be reassigned to a different state. So while it is an issue, it might not be as quite a big an issue as what some of the occupational reform proponents are making. And it does raise the question of how to handle inconsistent state-to-state scopes of practice and professional requirements. Generally, from what we've seen with the nurses' compacts and the physicians' compacts, is it can take years to develop compacts that address just one profession. And we have these 3 bills that propose creating a compact that deals with hundreds of professions all at once. So I know we threw a lot of information at you. We have the deregulation bills, the oversight and oversight reform bills, our Right to Earn a Living Acts, and the interstate compacts. So David and I would be happy to answer any questions on this.
Hi, Andrea. This is Deb Peters. I am curious as to how much traction these are really getting. It's like in Washington, we've had our conflict with our bill in the legislature for 3 sessions now, and it's likely to disappear as of next year because it's not going anywhere. How much traction are these other states getting on these challenges?
David or Elizabeth, do either one of you want to take that one?
Sure. So we're seeing a lot of traction develop because of the landscape architecture deregulation bills that are out there. Every time a bill like that is introduced, I mean, thankfully none of them have passed at this point, but it just creates a marker bills for other states to model. And there's a lot of misunderstandings and misperceptions about what landscape architecture is. That's why the education and advocacy to the state legislators, it's just so imperative that they really have a good understanding of the profession. In fact, a deregulation bill for landscape horticulturalists was just introduced in Louisiana several weeks ago. And while the bill, it only deregulates horticulturalists, the title of the bill is Landscape Architecture Deregulation. So again, I think it was whoever was drafting the bill didn't understand that there's a difference between landscape architects and landscape horticulturalists.
Thank you.
And I don't know if that question, Deb, referred also to the temporary compacts. I was on a call today with some folks from a variety of professions, and of course, the South Dakota bill died, as was pointed out, and I think the Arizona and Missouri bills, the legislature, it seems like when the legislators are contacted. And another thing about this is that going after one profession is tough because then they can organize, but these temporary compact licensure bills cover everybody. So what is happening is that everybody is now coming to the legislator and saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. And so what I heard today is that in Arizona and Missouri and even New Hampshire, where there is now one, the legislators are a little bit more receptive to listening to some of the issues here. So I don't know. It's hard to tell if that's going to get traction or not. Ultimately, it may be that if it doesn't, they just move on to something else.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other?
One, go forward.
Sorry, what was that? Somebody else have a question?
No, this is just Dave. We can probably move on.
Okay. Yeah, if no one else has any questions, we can move on to the next section, which I believe is David. We've got some members in the spotlight.
Ta-da! So now we'll cover some of your stories of best practices that you shared in the recent survey. Then we'll open it up for a little more discussion. First, thank you for all the responses to the survey we sent out a couple of weeks ago. We got 29 CLARB respondents and 19 ASLA. There's a lot of great activity going on around the country, both between boards and chapters and with advocacy interactions with lawmakers. First, let's take a look at some examples of the board chapter interactions. Broadly, they can be categorized as sharing information and meeting together. Information sharing and outreach is key. Just sharing meeting times goes a long way to build interaction between the board and the chapter. Legislative activity is another thing, that sharing what you know about bills of interest. The chapter is the main advocate, but sometimes board members may not be aware of pending legislation or vice versa. Also, shared events are a great thing to do, where both board and chapter representatives attend, including brown bag lunches for emerging professionals, celebration of new licensees. In Colorado here, we're planning to possibly recognize new licensees at our annual gathering in September, if we can work out the details. And joint presentations to students, either at pro-practice classes or with new students. But there are also challenges to effective board-chapter relationships. In some places, the board and the chapter are located in different states in some of those multi-state chapters. And just depending on the state, there are also perceptions or actual ethics law or iron curtain barriers between interactions between board members and the chapter. And also, building a relationship is a long-term process. You have to prioritize the engagement. Annual turnover of ASLA chapter leadership sometimes makes it difficult to build the relationships. Other things, if a board or chapter cancels or changes a planned meeting at the last minute, it can become a barrier to interaction. And of course, one of the challenges that all of us face is making the time to build these relationships. One board member reported that no one from the chapter had ever contacted their office. So let's take a look at some examples of effective interaction. Dean, are you on the line?
Yeah, hi David.
Hey Dean. I wear two hats. I work for CLARB, but I'm also the ASLA Colorado government affairs guy. And we, the ASLA chapter and the Colorado board, which Dean is a member of, or president of, met in January, I think, and we typically have a meeting a year to discuss issues when we have new officers on the ASLA committee. Dean, you want to talk about anything about our interaction process?
Sure, David, thanks. Yeah, the Colorado State Board, we try to meet with the ASLA Colorado chapter once a year, so it's usually myself and Joyce Young, our program director with the state. And it's really just a time to get together and share information. We sort of give updates about things the board has been looking at our meetings, whether that's complaints, legislation, et cetera. At this last meeting, we talked a lot about our sunset review last year and the fact that some of the landscape designers wanted to change some of the rules and regs to make the exemptions a little bit clearer. So we spent quite a bit of time just talking about that and how ASLA Colorado is going to work directly with them and then sort of coordinate any actions that the state board would need to take. So that's really what we try to do every year. And then we also have an ongoing outreach program where we go and meet with students at Colorado State and University of Colorado Denver just to tell them a little bit about the licensure process, why it's important. And Joyce put together a really nice PowerPoint presentation this year, and we just finished our presentation at UCD. I think it was in February sometime, so that went really well.
It's a great opportunity to share the information about the profession to students who are really focused just on their academic work and may not be completely aware of the larger scope of licensure or interaction with the chapter.
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty common theme, David.
Yep. So we also got some good comments from Stephen Pills. Stephen, are you on the line? Not sure if he's there. And in Nevada, Ellis Antunes from the board, are you on the line? Or anybody from Nevada?
I know Ellis is on. He had his phone muted.
Okay.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Else? I hear from Elizabeth that you all had some interesting interactions with legislative committee or pre-legislation committee. Do you want to share what you guys have been working on?
Yes, our sunset subcommittee in last December decided that they wanted to review all occupational boards, and we were lucky enough to be up in February to be looked at, and to actually went up for a review in front of the subcommittee. We had to prepare a 78-page review and answer all these questions for the for their committee. After going through that committee in February, in March, actually in this month, last week, the committee had a work session, and they reviewed what we had presented in February, and actually one of the items that came up was to either modify, terminate, or consolidate our board with other boards. And actually the committee decided that they would continue our board as it is, as a standalone board. They also recommended some improvements that we wanted to see to our statute, which was good for us.
Oh, good.
I won't go into that very deeply, but one of the things I took back from this was that if you're proactive to this committee and you show that you are actually attempting to strengthen your legislation and to modify it to make you more efficient, they were all good with that. They wanted to see that happen, and that was one of the items that we took back from that. So I think that helped our board to continue. We will find out what happens in June. They will be revisiting all boards because the governor's office is also doing a review of all boards. And they will be making a presentation in June to the legislative subcommittee on this, which is going to be very interesting. So we're not out of the woods yet, but I believe we have the legislators on our side. I don't know about the governor yet, but we're working on that. So,
Well, good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
With all your
If
work.
it hadn't been for our chapter, our ASLA chapter, to actually step up and fill the room, I think that would have gone against us rather than for us. And that's basically we had as many LAs from Nevada as we could get into. Actually, it was 2 rooms that we filled, so that was good. So.
Well, good. I think that's a good segue into advocacy. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. Thanks, Alice. So some of the examples of advocacy that came out of the survey. One was that messaging is key, showing that the profession is committed to the protection of health, safety, and welfare. And that's the reason that the profession is regulated. Any sort of argument about protection of the profession is a non-starter, and I think I'm probably preaching to the choir on that one. Another site tours in district, focusing on health, safety, and welfare issues and the importance to constituents. Consider having a site tour with elected officials and maybe emerging professionals. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little later on in the resources section. But remember, the lawmakers love to have hard hat photos showing them pointing at construction and talking to young professionals. Developing personal connections with legislators and giving them copies of Landscape Architecture magazine. I thought that was a great suggestion, that it shows the scope of practice and all different types of projects, and it's really an eye-opener for people who think that landscape architecture means trimming hedges. And building connections between the landscape architects and their communities, showing how landscape architecture affects communities and aligns with the legislative interests of the legislator. Small business owners and a lot of landscape architecture small business owners, and describe how students in state landscape architecture programs must, if they wanted to get licensed and we didn't have licensure, they'd have to go out of state. And remember, the emotionally connecting stories are often more compelling than facts and data. show how improper practice can cause harm. And then another good argument is if there's a question about changing regulatory requirements. The CLARB process to get licensure works pretty well if you're going from one state to another, so there's no need for an additional government system. Let's take a look at some specific stories now. Let's go to the next slide here. So, Billy Almond, are you on the line?
I am.
Great. I've heard a tale of your success with lawmakers in Virginia about the hair braiding and landscape architecture delicensure bill. You want to share that story?
Yes, your impromptu site tour.
Yeah.
It was very, very impromptu. We in Virginia have the distinction of being tried to be deregulated 3 times since our bill was passed just a few years ago. So the good news is we know how to fight it. But there was an opening for a major historic project that our firm had worked on in Virginia Beach a few weeks ago. Black tie events, 9 o'clock at night. And I'm in there talking to a bunch of friends, and I see this guy who looks very familiar from a few months ago, and went up to him and introduced myself, and come to find out he was the delegate in Virginia that had introduced legislation to deregulate us in January. And I had only had 25 minutes with him back in January when we were able to get him turned around. So it was perfect. He had had a few martinis. I was able to grab him. I said, can you give me 20 minutes? And walked him around the entire 12 acres of this 1928 renovated project through every step and ramp and every construction detail there was that I was able to show him. And at the conclusion of that, he looked at me and he goes, you know, I'm really embarrassed that I actually introduced the legislation. And so it says to me what we've been trying to do in Virginia, that the best defense to deregulation is a really good offense. And during the downtime between sessions is to get out there and meet these people and tell them what you do, because obviously this guy lumped us in with some other occupations, had no idea what we did. But it was just, I didn't put this together. It was just an amazing thing that happened that night, and was very successful, at least for this one legislator. So, fun story.
That's a great example of something that Elizabeth and I have been talking a lot about, is that the more you educate, the less you need to advocate. That's great.
Correct.
So let's talk a little bit about the Interstate Compact. Chad, I know Susan had to drop off, but Chad, are you on the line?
Yes, I am here.
Tell us what's been going on in South Dakota.
Well, we have the proud distinction of being the first state where this Interstate Compact for professional licensure was introduced. We learned about it through our state board in December, so we had some time to prepare. We learned that this was going to be introduced directly by the governor's office, and his motivation behind that was workforce development. So we as landscape architects, we have a joint lobbying group with a couple engineering societies and the land surveyor organization here in South Dakota. So like I said, we were able to kind of do some planning ahead of time and develop a game plan, and we were actually doing some lobbying before this was even introduced to the legislature. So we were actually able to start to educate the legislature before they had actually seen the bill. But our session runs January through March, so it's super short and super fast-paced. If you're familiar with South Dakota, the capital is about 3 hours from anywhere, so it's the middle of nowhere. In the wintertime, driving there kind of sucks. And even the legislators don't really want to be there. So when you show up to testify against a bill, it really means something. They really appreciate it, and they pay attention. And because of our lobby group, we hired a lobbyist, and we were able to kind of join forces with pharmacists, the optometrists, dentists, social workers, and some of the independent, smaller physician organizations in the state, and kind of all together provide a pretty solid background of why this is a bad idea. And luckily, this was it was defeated in the House pretty soundly, so it didn't move on to the Senate.
And wasn't there was a Senate bill that was sponsored by most of the, if not all of the Republican senators, if I remember correctly, that opted it out.
The Senate Majority Leader is an independent position, and he didn't like this bill at all. So he wanted to kind of take the lead. If this did pass the House, he wanted to have a defense set in place. So he introduced a bill that would exempt several professions, and luckily we were included on that as well. And that was kind of the backup plan, which ultimately didn't move forward because the initial bill was defeated. But the large medical organizations in the state were pressured politically by the governor's office to support the bill. So it was good that we had some of these independent physicians on our side.
Oh, good. Well, congratulations on your work and a good example of working with allies.
Thanks.
In Ohio, Amy and Carmine, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey.
Can you hear?
So,
hey.
I can hear you. You sound great. So in the survey results, you said that you guys have been working together quite a bit on planning some stuff. You want to share what you've been working on?
Yeah, sure. Basically, I guess I could start back just a few years ago when I was chapter president in 2015, and we had something similar happen that I think someone said just a minute ago in Nevada, where in a budget bill they were thinking about getting rid of our licensure board and merging us with the architects board. And I think at that time they were talking about having 5 architects and 1 LA on the board or something of that nature. And we were successful in fighting that at that time, and right now we still have our licensure board as it existed then. But something that it really brought to our attention as a chapter was that we needed to be more involved in legislative affairs, particularly having a lobbyist on our behalf, because we just couldn't follow everything that we needed to follow. And so at that time, I thought that my next step after president was to step into the legislative affairs role that was vacated by Jeannie, who served it well before me. And I wanted to really be more proactive in our approach to dealing with these issues. And so, as many people have already said on this call, it's really been about educating legislators and also having a very strong relationship with our licensure board, because what I came to find out was that the licensure board really is limited in what they can do from the lobbying side of things. So it's important to get the information from them, but then also to be able to do the things we can do because we represent the profession as the chapter. So I attend their quarterly board meetings and hear the things that concern them, or the things that they're following, and also share with them the things that our lobbyist shares with us. And so it's really about, number one, I think communication and sharing that information between each other, but then also using the resources we have between the board and the chapter to educate and also defend ourselves when these issues arise. So I think that really states most of it. I mean, I think we try to talk as much as possible. Something we did do recently was went through the CLARB checklist together. So we had 4 of our chapter leaders and the members of the board, and we walked through the checklist and talked about things that we do well already and talked about things that we could do better. And one of those things was really inviting the board members to call into our chapter calls every month, which we hadn't been doing before, which we started to do in the last 2 to 3 months, which has been really beneficial because then they get to hear the things directly from our executive board as opposed to me just kind of reiterating that stuff when I go to their meetings. So like I said, I think number one is communication, and that's really what we've tried to do between the board and the chapter.
That's great.
But Amy, is there anything you wanted to add to that, if she's still on? Maybe she's not, but yeah, I think that's pretty much what I had.
Yeah, that's great information. Thanks, Carmine. And I think that's, so those are the case studies we pulled from the survey. If anyone has anything that they want to share briefly, we'll open up the opportunity here. All right. Go on to the next. Any questions about anything we've just been talking about? And I think next up is resources.
All right, thanks, David.
Slightly out of order. This is resources.
So as we get towards the end of today's discussion, just wanted to review some of the resources that we have available to both ASLA and CLARB members to really help facilitate the licensure defense efforts and to help facilitate best practices as well. We've highlighted many of these at our last web summit, but I want to take a few moments to remind you of what's out there and to let you know of several new resources that will be coming your way soon. So a resource that we do currently have available on the ASLA website is a how-to guide for putting together a site tour with a public official. As you heard from Billy, how effective these site tours can be. And especially for the ASLA chapters on the call, please mark August 4th on your calendars. This is what we have designated as ASLA National In-District Site Tour Day. So you'll hear more about that in the coming months, but just wanted you to put that on your calendar and save the date. David Sprunt and I are also working on fact sheets that will be coming your way soon, hopefully by the end of this week. And we'll provide the information that we had in the slides, as well as some additional information on the 4 different trends that we're seeing: the deregulation, the regulatory oversight bodies, the Right to Earn a Living Acts, and the interstate interstate compacts for temporary licensure. Again, those should be available to you towards the end of the week. I'm sure we will email all of our respective members, and they will also be posted on our individual websites. Okay. Hopefully you are aware that we also have a board chapter contact list that's available to you. Again, both this resource is posted on the ASLA website as well as the CLARB website. And if you haven't already, we strongly encourage chapters and boards to reach out and really get to know one another. As Carmine talked about, just the benefits of having that relationship. And I promise you, at least from the chapter end, they don't bite. So, and then moving on to an additional document that we have available for the boards and chapters is best practices. And this was referred to earlier. Go ahead.
Can I add one thing to that about you said they don't bite? This is Carmine again. I just wanted to say as well, one of the things that it opened my eyes to once I started attending the meetings was that they're actually talking about the same exact issues that we talk about as the chapter. And so the fact that you could both work on the issues together makes a whole lot of sense because they're sitting there talking about the same thing. So I think that is just something to point out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carmine. So we did put together a fact sheet of best practices for board chapter relationship building. And as we've learned from the recent surveys and the conversations we've had at the ASLA Advocacy Summit in Milwaukee and at the CLARB annual meeting, just how important these relationships are. And we're not going to go through them one by one, but all of these and more can be found on the fact sheet. And then we also have, and David talked about a lot of these earlier, best practices for advocacy. And again, a lot of these resources are available on our individual websites. Next slide. And then ASLA and CLARB both offer tracking for all of these licensure bills that we've gone through today. And the tracking results are available to our members on our website. You'll find a map and you can click on the state that you're interested in and it will take you right to information about the bill. For the ASLA website, you can find the map by going to our advocacy webpage and then just simply clicking on the link, Track Licensure Legislation. And David, do you want to talk about the
Sure.
legislative tracking on CLARB's website?
Sure. So for CLARB members, there's resources on the licensure support tools page. It includes the contact list for each state's board and chapter representatives, as well as a best practices document and other information. We're tracking legislation in every state, and you can see at the bottom of this bottom of the screenshot, you can see the list of legislation that we're tracking. Anytime a new activity on a bill happens, it'll show up there, and you can click that and it'll go to our bill track vendor site, and it will show you all the details of the bill, including the sponsors and summaries and full text and everything, any activity. So ASLA and CLARB are using different tracking systems, but we both want to know the same thing: what bills are going to affect licensure or potentially could affect licensure. And that's how we know what's going on. Next.
Great. And another resource we didn't create a slide for, but just to remind everyone that ASLA has available our Landscape Architecture Licensure Handbook, which is a compilation of legal cases that look at the different elements of practice of landscape architecture and the public health, safety, and welfare, and cases dealing with all of those, legal cases dealing with all of those different practice areas. So that's a really great resource to go to when you're looking for examples of public health, safety, and welfare and harm. So if more of these right to earn a living acts pass and we have to meet this higher legal standard, this will be an excellent resource to turn to. The whole document is downloadable online, and I believe it's available on the CLARB website as well. And we have hard copies here at ASLA National that I'm happy to send out to any chapter or board. Just shoot me an email and we'll get that right off to you.
I can speak from personal experience with that, with ASLA Colorado's efforts with Sunset Review last year. We used examples of harm that poor design can cause that were really compelling and convinced a few lawmakers to vote our way, I think. So there's just a ton of examples in that book. It's a really good resource. I can't emphasize it enough. We can go on to the next.
All right, and just to wrap up here today, I want to let you know about some upcoming events and make sure that you're marking your calendar for our first ever ASLA CLARB Joint Licensure Summit. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. That will be taking place June 22nd through the 24th. Then, as I had mentioned just a few moments ago, August 4th is our ASLA in-district site tour day. In September is the CLARB conference, their annual meeting. And then the following month in October, we have the ASLA annual meeting. And I'm happy to say that ASLA and CLARB have been selected to give a presentation, an education session at the ASLA annual meeting on protecting the public and talking about a lot of the threats that we discussed here on this call today. And I will be on that panel, as well as David Sprunt, Jeannie Martin, who's the VP of Government Affairs for ASLA National, and Jonathan
Giels.
Giels, thank you. Jonathan Giels from Indiana. All right, next slide. Thank you. So our 2018 Licensure Summit, I'm excited to tell you, will be in Columbus, Ohio, again, June 22nd through 24th. The registration for this will be available in very early May, right after the ASLA spring meeting, which takes place at the end of April. And we're still putting together the agenda. Of course, we'll be debriefing on the 2018 legislative session, looking forward to planning for 2019. And If you all have any ideas for sessions, please feel free to shoot them to me or to David or Veronica or Joel at CLARB, because we'll be meeting next week to really start discussing and laying out the format for the two-day event. Okay. And here you have some of the key contacts at CLARB and ASLA. I am excited to announce that we have a new staff member at ASLA, Bradley Rolls. He's joined us last week as our State Government Affairs Manager. So he's still getting up to speed in this world of landscape architecture licensure, but he will definitely be involved in this issue moving forward. And with that, we've got just a couple minutes left if there are any additional questions or comments for the team.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out today or tuning in, and I hope you gained some good insight into what's going on in licensure around the country, and get out there and keep educating and working together.